The sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is nothing you will expect. What I mean by that are not the surprising new gameplay mechanics like the skydiving or mysterious time feature, but the circumstances around the game. Nintendo just released a new update on Breath of the Wild 2 with a rather unsurprising message of delaying the game once again to spring 2023. On first sight, the reason seems to be quite obvious. They want to implement some final touches and just make sure everything feels polished like in the first one. If the game is going to be finally released next year, we had to wait 6 whole years to play the sequel of the biggest Zelda title up to this point, which is quite interesting to say the least. After all, you would expect them to reuse the foundation of Breath of the Wild and apply this blueprint to the second game in order to save time and work. The first proper gameplay trailer even confirmed this idea by using the same visual style and some borrowed concepts, like enemies or the game's world. However, the remaining question is, what is taking them so long? Why do they need the same development time for a game that seemingly does not even build a complete new world and only just adds ideas to an already massive playground? The answer may surprise you, but Breath of the Wild 2 very deliberately hides something from us, which we surely will not see coming. The first and probably biggest puzzle to this long development is surely why they need so much time in the first place. Going by the information they gave us on the first Breath of the Wild, one of the main obstacles to overcome was the complex physics engine in combination with the extensive world. It's easy to assume that this required certainly half of the whole development cycle due to how important it was to get the interaction with all the elements right. Naturally, they don't want to let this enormous challenge go to waste and will obviously reuse it for the sequel. The same goes for the visual art style, which is largely just the logical successor to a sequel that plays after the first adventure. With half of the work being basically done, the estimated deadline to get this game finished shouldn't take that long and could come out pretty soon. After all, Majora's Mask followed these steps as well and was released just 1 year after Ocarina of Time. Of course, there were some decisions made that many people still don't like, and with 1 additional year or 2, we could have gotten more dungeons, a better refined gameplay, but Majora's Mask still enjoys a very special reputation. It is one of the most unique experiences in the Zelda series. Maybe it turned out as it is because there was no time to question ideas, but even though Breath of the Wild seems to enjoy a fairly patient treatment from Nintendo's side, I think this Zelda adventure will be exceptional for completely different reasons. Why are certain games disliked and loved at the same time? There must be something that creates an utter antipathy, whereas other players would adore a game for the very same features. Majora's Mask, as I stated, is a very good example, but you could also expand this idea to other franchises. Super Mario Sunshine is either despised or praised for its special setting and style, but what makes these games so divergent? It's quite simple: their courage to purposefully reject some people's interest. This is the main reason for their duality among the communities, because the developers were very well aware about the consequences if they would implement a clock on the player's screen. They knew some players would automatically get turned down by the time pressure, but they didn't care, and for what reason? Because the odd idea is more worth exploring than potentially appealing to a wider audience. A more recent example would be Bowser's Fury, the side adventure for Super Mario 3D World. Here a giant Bowser starts to rampage through the whole map in regular intervals, and just by describing this feature with 1 simple sentence, you can instantly guess the problem that comes along. Bowser can get annoying in specific situations. You may be just exploring a section of the world when suddenly the giant turtle appears and forces you to hide and wait until it disappears. Of course, they implemented some measures to ensure a relatively smooth experience, but the most important reason of all is the compelling sounding idea. It's so easy to imagine someone at Nintendo just bringing up the very simple but extremely appealing thought process: what if a giant Bowser would chase Mario through an open world? Most of these ideas combine the sad fact that they are often rushed. Majora's Mask as well as Sunshine did both not enjoy an acceptable development cycle, and even though Majora's Mask might have benefited from it, Sunshine was plagued with some minor glitches and clear mud. And when you think about it, isn't this weird? Isn't it strange that these extraordinary ideas don't get the elaboration they clearly need because of their unusual nature? The point of falling back on what Ocarina of Time already provided, namely assets and character models, should be to spare time in that regard and focus on the unique concepts Majora's Mask is proud of. In contrast to the common opinion, recycling should not be an excuse to bring out the game faster, but concentrate on the peculiar premise that can only be worked out when the foundation is already set. Of course, there's nothing wrong with repurposing the work in order to be more consistent, but this isn't something the Zelda series must strive for. The unique selling point of the franchise is how different each title is. There's certainly a high risk in a behavior like that, yet it's the same reason why I think Zelda still exists to this huge extent. So what happens if we use the weird, interesting idea but left out the restricted development time? Well, Breath of the Wild 2 is going to show us the answer. In light of all the information we currently have, the main feature of the sequel is once again going to be the sky, filled with countless small self-contained islands. We cannot know how similar the world beneath will be, but it's most definitely sure that Breath of the Wild 2 strives for a much grander scope. It's very likely sky combat and movement in general plays a much bigger role, going by the patents Nintendo registered. Of course, there are some other features like the time mechanic or fire-breathing weapon, though all of this does not justify 6 years of development, right? If there are not going to be whole landscapes in the horizon, we can assume the sky islands mirror the shrines from Breath of the Wild with separate challenges, but what would be the point of this? What is the point of simply copying the style of the predecessor and changing the terminology to fit the new premise? If anything, this is the logical thought process of a fan, but Nintendo does not act logical. The very first trailer shown during E3 2019 should set the tone for not only the game, but how Nintendo would present of information. Vague, yet kinda clear details draw the picture of a sequel that lets Breath of the Wild appear like a mere introduction to a way more sinister adventure. The supposed to be Ganondorf is portrayed like a forgotten being, marked by a time no one should know, and even though there was just one small shot of him directly staring at us, it was more than enough to appear much more ominous than all of his past reincarnations together. Eiji Aonuma confirmed this mysterious tone by stating how they want to create something similar to Majora's Mask story-wise, and although we don't know what he means by that, it's an indicator how they want to approach the narrative. Link, who suffered more than enough in Breath of the Wild, is not able to catch a break and is immediately attacked by malice. As a consequence, his arm portrays the shape of a monster with its dark, rotten colors and sharp nails, whereas the Master Sword looks as pathetic as the weapon of a monster. For a company like Nintendo, it's extremely important how they present their heroes, and if we assume that all this stuff happens at the start of the game, isn't it interesting how they expect us to look at the Link in such a state? It's extremely reminiscent of Majora's Mask, where the Skull Kid is almost one step ahead all the time and puts Link easily in the shoes of an embarrassing weak state. You know, the hero that defeated the mighty Demon King. What I basically try to say is Breath of the Wild 2 is going to be Majora's Mask with a proper development time. While the narrative is a step into a very fascinating direction, it's the gameplay which left many players in confusion. Assuming they are using the same world with some additions, the game should absolutely be done by now. Only adding stuff is much more reminiscent of an expansion, which is why I think they are playing with us. Nintendo didn't want to reveal the title of the game because it has some potential spoilers in it, probably the main gimmick of the game, as Zelda games usually have. If this game is going to be a two-player mode or something completely different is not clear, but it has to be something more than simply exploring the sky. Furthermore, the original Breath of the Wild already had some minor issues processing the whole game smoothly, so how can we expect an even wider world with some serious limitations in this performance? All of this just sounds too odd, which reflects the weird nature of the game. The music is sometimes rewound and it seems like the marketing is mirroring the puzzling nature of the sequel Nintendo knows people are waiting to play, so of course they are playing with expectations everyone has. But what could this brave gimmick I've talked about be? Going by how Nintendo likes to follow up to one of their most iconic achievements like Ocarina of Time or Mario 64, they will not simply observe what worked in the first place and give us the same experience. No, they will rethink the system and, in my belief, probably ditch the open nature of Breath of the Wild. If this means no climbing is up to debate, but if the narrative plays a bigger role, then it will be most likely not possible to beat the final boss right from the start. They are taking away the freedom of the first game, maybe even as a foundation for the main gimmick? After all, Zelda stories work best if the story is wrapped around the gameplay scenario, so what if they are doing the completely opposite to what Breath of the Wild stood for and somehow make it work? It sounds unbelievable regarding how well received the first one was, but as I said, they took their time to work out whatever they are planning to do with the main feature. Zelda sequels were never meant to make the predecessors obsolete, which is why they can take the series to a much more courageous and maybe risky direction. Of course, this would mean putting some fans off, but if there was a time to be brave with the series, then it's definitely now.